Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? Well, it is day 6 of RPG A Day 2018, and our question or prompt for today is how can players make a world seem real? So, full disclaimer, this post is going to be colored by my preferences and biases because there's a certain experience I tend to like, and it's also probably going to come across as a little preachy, and I don't mean to be preachy, but it's asking me how, and so I'm going to tell you how as far as I know. So just be warned, that's going to come out a little bit. I noticed that this post does not say, or the prompt does not say, how can you make it feel realistic? Because that's a totally different subject. We're not talking about verisimilitude or realism. It's more like, because the genre could be very, very different. But how do you make the world seem real to you? And the short answer is, if you want the world to seem real, act as if it's real. But I'll give you the long answer. For me, the first thing is acting as if the character was real. As if they had real motivations, real desires. Thinking about what makes them tick. Do they trust this non-player character? Do they not trust them? Why are they accepting this mission, if that's what they're doing thereon? Are they having second thoughts about that? If things go really badly, are they willing to accept the consequences? What will the consequences be? How are they going to feel about that if that happens? All that sort of stuff. Do they what kind of bonds do they have with the other people there? And you don't necessarily have to have an experience as the character or in character like the way I like it, but you can have a very out of character experience with in that manner, but not just treating them like they're a pawn or a token on the board, and you really don't care what happens to them. But just really figuring out who they are, what makes them tick. Fleshing them out, making them a real, living, breathing human. And then they don't exist in a vacuum. They push on the world pushes back, and so you start to look up. First you've looked inward. What makes me tick? Then you look up and who are these other player characters? What makes them tick? Start to think about what the relationships that your character has with them. They start to become real. And they're not just, the other players or other player characters. They actually start to become living, breathing people themselves, and you start to develop bonds. You start to kind of have some kind of understanding with them. And then you expand that. Okay, what about the non-player characters? Who's this guy? Do I trust him? Why don't I trust him? Is he somebody that interests me? Why? Do we have some sort of relationship? What is it? Why am I willing to go on a mission for this guy? Or do I have some kind of misgivings or all that kind of stuff? Don't just treat them as conduits of information or for the game master to give you challenges or whatnot. Think of them as actual, real, living and breathing people. And then you kind of expand that out even more to the various factions and organizations in the world, all that sort of stuff. They're just like people, except their reactions or their motivations can be a little bit more convoluted. And I'm not going to change my blog, but I'm totally going to steal part of this answer from somebody else, because a friend of mine, who's on the other side of the world, posted first, and I said, man, I can't believe I forgot about that. And he mentions the idea of he didn't call it this, but I'm going to call it sentimentality, where you start to develop attachments to objects in the world, whether it's locations or little trinkets you have, or your starship or whatever it happens to be. I'm totally stealing his example, but that tends to make the world seem a lot more real, because that's what we do in real life. We develop sentimental attachments to things, to places, some really odd, bizarre stuff. So that can once again make our characters seem real, but make the world seem real as well. And let's see, what other interesting thing can you do, or what can you do here? Well, speaking of interesting, follow your character's interests around. Now, this doesn't mean you have to do my guy syndrome, but the idea is, you've sat down and talked. Okay, we're going to play this kind of genre. We're going to play this kind of game. We've all agreed to go on this mission, whatever it happens to be. So there's some kind of parameters that you put around here. We're not going to go outside these boundaries, but inside those boundaries, act as if your character would. Maybe your character is having second thoughts. Maybe your character becomes very interested in something over here. Don't get, and this is this is going to see where you're going to see my bias and preference coming out if I can talk. Is don't be so hung up on what you're supposed to be doing or on the story, or what the game master thinks you should be interested in. Start becoming, just follow what your character is interested in. That tends to make the world seem very, very real at that point, because that's what real people do. They tend to follow their noses, to follow what they're actually interested in. So don't be afraid to do that sort of thing. At that point, you can, once again, it makes things seem very real is the point. As long as you're not being a jerk about it, and you talk to each other. But that opens up a whole world, or makes the world. It opens the world right up, makes it seem real. Is what I'm trying to say here. Speaking of doing things, to do it, just do it. The mechanics are there to inform us, to help us, to maybe reinforce what the genre is. Maybe that's the way the mechanics work. It's to inform us like what kind of competence our characters have, all that sort of stuff. But for the most part, narrate what you're actually doing. Narrate your intentions. That's going to make the game world seem a lot more authentic, rather than constantly filtering everything through what the mechanics actually say. They're there to help you, but I don't live the game through them. Is the point I'm trying to make. And as far as narration goes, in general, narrate the heck out of stuff. Don't just talk about the mechanics. We need to use game speak, but talk about what your character is actually doing, what that actually looks like. If there's some kind of social mechanics, narrate like what you're actually doing. How that actually looks. Don't be afraid to embellish stuff. And expanding narration just a little bit more, don't be afraid to narrate into existence objects that should be there given the genre, given exactly where you are. The worst thing that's going to happen is the game master is going to tell you, no, in this case that's not there, or you're pushing the genre too far. But the idea of, I'm a musketeer and I'm going to say, well, instead of asking, are there curtains, big long curtains in the Louvre that I can swing down on, just say, I grab the curtains, I slash them, and I swing down, I try to swing down to the street below. That little thing can really open up the world, make it seem real once again, because otherwise, once you start playing the game with 20 questions, which I know is a habit we can all fall into, that kind of breaks the spell, so to speak, and the world, at least for me, starts to seem less real at that particular time. And last, but definitely not least, make choices as if the consequences were actually real, as if the stakes really matter to you. And make these choices from the perspective of the character, not from the player moving them around. We've all been in those situations where we're supposed to keep exploring the dungeon because that's what we're here for, and we're going to get XP and all this kind of stuff, or we're on this mission. To me, the world's going to seem a lot more real, your character's going to seem a lot more real if you start making choices based upon, okay, I'm really this person, they're really in this situation, what would they do here? Because oftentimes what they would actually do is very different than what you would think you ought to do in terms of the game or the story or whatever it happens to be. Make those choices, and that doesn't mean you can't be heroic and act despite consequences, but take those into consideration. Make the stakes of the game world, or act as if the stakes were real. The more you act as if things were actually real, the more they become real. As Einstein said, when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. So that's my big answer, and there was the answer in the beginning. If you want the game world to seem real, act as if it's real. Your character, the other player characters, the NPCs, the objects, the stakes, everything in it, when you act as if all that stuff is real, it will become real to you. Yeah, so that's my answer for that day. Hopefully that wasn't too preachy, but that's the way I see it. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Have a good one, kids.